Hello, everyone. Welcome to the FPF Book Club. Very excited to be talking about this book today. We have a great one. I'm joined by Professor Simon Chesterman from the other side of the world. I am joining from Denver, Colorado in the US, and he is joining us from Singapore. Professor Simon Chesterman is David Marshall Professor and Vice Provost for Educational Innovation at the National University of Singapore, where he is also Dean of NUS College. He serves as Senior Director of AI Governance at AI Singapore and editor of the Asian Journal of International Law and co-president of Law School's Global League. He was educated in Melbourne, Beijing, Amsterdam, and Oxford. He teaches extensive classes, including at Melbourne, Oxford, Southampton, Columbia, and has written fairly extensively already. And very excited to be talking about one of his books, Artifice, a novel of AI set in Singapore, and contains a great variety of themes and visuals and topics that I personally really enjoyed and can only recommend everybody read. So welcome, Simon. Thank you so much for joining us. And please tell us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to write Artifice.
Well, thanks so much, Jordan. And depending on where you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, as it is here in Singapore. And it's a real pleasure to be talking about this. So basically, Artifice came out of larger, much more serious work I was doing on the regulation and governance of artificial intelligence. And I suppose there's a kind of personal reason and a professional reason. The personal reason is my kids, for some reason, had no interest in reading my books about data protection or regulation of artificial intelligence. And so fiction was a way to reach them. But also professionally, as I was doing a book on regulation of AI, there were all sorts of much more speculative things, forward-looking things that I didn't really think I could include within the volume that had footnotes and that was published by a university press. And so I had a little notebook where I'd write down ideas and thoughts, and then realized that actually fiction was a great way to explore these things, because there's a long history of science fiction helping not just push the boundaries of science, so things like the space shuttle were first thought of in science fiction, but also to think through some challenges that we might confront as a species, and maybe to do it in theory before we did it in practice might better prepare us for it in some way at least. So Jordan, you're getting the accidentally muted yourself award today. I will keep talking, but I'm much more interested in hearing your next question.
I appreciate that so much. I made it to Tuesday. I try myself every week to see how far I can make it into the week without doing that. Thank you so much. And it clearly shows through what sort of policies you're thinking about as you were writing Artifice. And I can kind of see in how AI is simultaneously regulated when it comes to Janice, the character of AI in the book, but also other aspects of AI and technology throughout. So I'm very curious, were there particular policies or AI advancements that you were holding in your mind that stand out as you were writing Artifice?
Yeah, well, so I should probably stipulate that I finished Artifice before ChatGPT was released, but really was anticipating sort of natural language processing. It was pretty clear we would be going in the direction of being able to converse with an AI system as if it were a human. Candidly, I thought it would take a little bit longer to get to where we are today. So if you like, that was the kind of technical side of it. In terms of policies and practices, I suppose one of the things that I've found both interesting and frustrating in interacting with AI researchers, in particular computer engineers, computer scientists, is this bizarre phenomenon of the P-doom. This is the idea that some people have a probability that they have in their mind that the chances that what they're working on will either wipe out humanity or have some sort of devastating impact on humanity. And it seems kind of crazy that if you seriously think that there is a 10% chance that what you're doing is going to wipe out humanity, you then go back to work and keep doing it. That seemed kind of strange. And in my professional work, I'm on the sort of governance side of this, trying to help ensure that the machines are fair, accountable, transparent, and so on, and that we monitor how humans are going to use them. But in terms of the book, what I thought would be really interesting is to kind of flip that around so that it's not the computer engineers who have a P-doom about AI, but what if AI had a P-doom about humanity? And so the kind of key moment, sometimes books are written from the beginning to the end, sometimes from the end going backwards, like a whodunit. In many ways, this book was really written from the middle out, where what I was most interested in was getting to this point where, at a crucial moment, Janus, this AI system, says that you humans, you spent so much time worrying about containing, controlling me, worried whether you could trust me. Did it ever enter your heads whether I should trust you? And that was the thing I was really wanting to get at, the idea that a system that we designed might actually be suspicious of us, not necessarily good or evil, but just suspicious of us and wanting to know whether it could trust us. And I thought that would be a really interesting dynamic to play with.
That's an absolutely fascinating dynamic. And many scholars and journalists and writers have talked about how AI can sort of be a mirror for us to look at ourselves, and we may or may not like what we see. Building on your thought there, one of the things I noticed was sort of this dichotomy around Janus, where he is very heavily policed, very heavily contained, very heavily regulated. But going out in the world, we can see around Singapore and around this future place that in many ways, technologies such as drones and robots are sort of the ones regulating and policing the humans. Can you say a little bit more about how you set up that dichotomy?
Yeah, well, so, I mean, the book is set in a speculative future, approximately 20 years or so in the future. And yes, there's sort of climate change has had negative consequences for many people. And technology clearly is going to proliferate. Surveillance is clearly proliferating around the world. And so, yes, you're right. This is a society that has been transformed in some directions that it seems pretty clear we're already going in terms of surveillance, the ability to have things delivered by drones, things like that are clearly coming. But also that inequality has massively increased, that the climate is no longer what it used to be, and that the economy is no longer what it used to be. So those were sort of background things. But I did want to sort of separately have this idea of some kind of transformative technology in the person of Janus that actually has this sort of spark of something that looks a lot like consciousness, and that would be seen as something to contain, to control. And then there's the problem that by containing and controlling a system like this, you run the risk of creating the very thing you're trying to avoid. Because by containing it, by controlling it, you're undermining its willingness to trust you. But if you trust it and release it, then there's a risk that things turn out terribly. So that was the kind of split I was trying to play around with, the idea that we become ever more familiar with many kinds of technology, but that there might be something a little bit different about a technology that embodies something that, as I said, looks a lot like consciousness.
Really interesting there. I love that. And it's a really interesting dichotomy to set up for us to ask questions about ourselves and what our future looks like in relationship to technology. You mentioned, really interestingly, climate change and sort of economic policies in this future, speculative future of Singapore. You sort of describe in your world building references to environmental policies like the seawall, or economic policies such as a universal basic income, or UBIs. How did these policies interact with technology policy or AI policy sort of off the page? And are there lessons that you're sort of trying to communicate through this part of the book?
Yeah, this is the other thing that fiction enables you to do, is that I think on a day-to-day basis, we're very worried about short-term things. So we're worried about bias, quite rightly. We're worried about misinformation, quite rightly. But in the longer term, we can see perhaps most clearly the environmental devastation that is coming from the climate emergency, or what sometimes is called the climate era. And AI is clearly exacerbating that. Secondly, we can see the real prospect of some kind of disruption of the economy. And so what I thought I'd do with the book is kind of simplify and then exaggerate. Simplify those ideas and then exaggerate them to a plausible conclusion. And so in terms of the environment, Singapore is anticipating that the sea level will rise, I think something like 1.3 meters by around 2100. And there are real proposals to fortify the island in terms of raising a seawall, not quite as big as the one I designed, but the idea is there. And in terms of the impact on the economy, the idea of a universal basic income, when I was writing about 4 years ago when I started this, was much more speculative. But I think we're seeing that being taken a lot more seriously now, including by some of the people involved in AI research, but also governments around the world, I think, are starting to recognize that the dislocation that can be experienced when an economy is under stress because of rapidly changing jobs. One way to try and address that is through trying to ensure that the economy doesn't collapse. But the sort of exaggeration in Artifice is the idea that the economy has gone very quickly from really focused on domestic production to domestic consumption. And so this idea of the UBIs, the universal basic income recipients, is that there's the potential that there's a whole generation, there's no real work for them to do, but the economy requires them to consume. And so that kind of self-referential economic movement is both attractive. I mean, it's nice to get a free lunch, but also deeply depressing because you're not actually doing anything. All you're doing is consuming. And I think that was trying to reflect on the risk that I suppose people have played around with since the humans in Wall-E, where they're sitting in their chairs just watching social media. So at its heart, the novel is really trying to ask, well, do we want this? And if we don't, what are we going to do about it?
Really interesting. And it definitely made me question, as someone who perceivably could support something like a universal basic income, does that support what people want? Ask questions about what policies may enable tech or disable humans at the same time. Very much part of that whole, what are we weighing, what are we choosing in the speculative future, and possibly in the real future. We do have a question in our chat. Thank you, Marlies. Marlies would like to know, what do you make of certain AI companies offering social workers their AI or models to use for free? How would that fit into the world of Artifice, where AI models are available for free use, perceivably for the public good?
Yeah, well, I think the idea of counseling or mental wellness or social work enhanced by AI is, in one sense, attractive. There's clearly, just to focus on counseling, there are clearly tens of millions of people in the world who would benefit from some kind of counseling who may never be in a position to meet with a human counselor. And so is that sort of chat support better than nothing? Probably, I suspect. Are there real risks? Absolutely. And I think many of the people listening in on this would be familiar with cases where there have been suicides associated with discussions with chatbots, sometimes even in a sort of pretend mental health space. I mean, to me, with my professor hat on, one of the things that really shocks me is that if the National University of Singapore, if anyone here were to develop the equivalent of a large language model that could, among other things, dispense mental health advice, among other things, we would have institutional review boards, ethics panels, consent protocols before anything could be released. And none of this applies to the technology companies. And I suppose that's one of the other questions I'm trying to ask in both the book, but also my more academic work, which is how we need to change the incentives so that these companies aren't trying to buy goodwill through doing the occasional good work or adopting the occasional good sort of AI governance policy, but actually being held to account, and that the humans who are on the receiving end of some of this software understand that we're not just beta testers for new software, we are laboratory rats in a grand experiment. And so again, one of the things you can do in fiction is sort of blast forward and examine that. So to the question, absolutely, I can imagine that being something that would be made available. But I suppose the question would be whether that's the best solution to a mental health crisis or a mental health, the sort of social problems that exist. In the book, it would be, you have a chat and you get a bunch of money. Is that really dealing with the underlying problems? And more importantly, perhaps, is that the foundation for a rich and fulfilling life? And if the answer to either or both of those is no, then maybe we need to rethink some of those early assumptions about how we address needs through technology. when some of the challenges are being created by technology.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting things I think to attach to this, at least in the US, and referencing lightly the Colorado AI Act, which is the first in the US for AI regulation, one of the things we are trying to do is contain it to things like, for lack of a better term, paper pushing, the organizational, the everyday admin work. In your book, we see a couple of examples of this. I was thinking of the police robot at the entrance of the station. Do we think it really ends there with just sort of grunt work and replacing the everyday humdrum? Or do you think we eventually will start there and go to more direct engagement with humans through things like mental health crises or therapy and other aspects as shown in Artifice? Or is it possible to contain it to the tasks that I don't want to say nobody wants to do, because I do know people who actually really enjoy doing things like writing their own citations by hand. But do we start there and go somewhere? Exactly. I always know there's an academic out there who enjoys it. Do we start with what we have socially decided as unimportant or boring jobs and then slowly tick away or chip away into jobs that feel like they're unnecessary?
Yeah, I mean, this is what's sometimes called, I think, the dirty, dangerous, and dull jobs, and I think there are real problems with that kind of framing. Partly because, I mean, something we might regard as dirty or dangerous or dull, someone else might feel is fulfilling, and if the alternative is doing nothing, it's somewhat patronizing to say even the person who collects the garbage would be better off just sitting watching TikTok all day rather than earning a living. I would want to think very carefully before deciding for that person. But I think there are bigger structural challenges to the kind of question you're alluding to, which is where are the economic incentives driving us? And I think one of the challenges, including in the US, and there's a great book, Power and Progress, by Simon Johnson and Devin Akimoglu, I think his name is, Nobel Prize winners, which is that the incentives for investing in technology at the moment in a place like the United States, the tax incentives are greater to basically buy an AI system than to hire a human. And so often the incentives are really pushing us to replace as many humans as possible. That's also the economic incentive. These tech companies, which are driven by profit, they're for-profit companies. That's perfectly understandable. The alternative was briefly experimented with in OpenAI, and there was a fight. Sam Altman was sacked briefly and then went back, and that basically was that the money won in that case. And so these companies are incentivized by profits. And so there are a couple of ways in which you can think of how AI could be deployed. And I think Stuart Russell came up with the idea there are met needs and unmet needs. So met needs are things we can already do, including the kind of boring jobs you were describing, paper pushing, a lot of administrative work, a lot of legal work. You could do things more cheaply and more quickly with AI, and that might save some companies some money. It might also save some people some money. That's one possibility. And then there's the unmet needs. These are the things that no human could ever do. Things like what won the Nobel Prize for chemistry last year, the protein folding, some incredible manipulation of huge amounts of data, which is being incentivized. So at the moment, because these companies have quarterly earning calls, they need to demonstrate value. The push is really to replace humans. That's the fastest way to earn money. But if we want AI to really be transformative, then we need to push on those sort of unmet goals, unmet needs. But that's not where the economics are. And so I think that's a couple of the big problems. And then when you bring it down to a day-to-day basis, which jobs are going to get outsourced? Actually, I think the better framing is which jobs are not going to be outsourced, or which ones will be last. And there seem to be kind of three categories in that area. And the first is the jobs that are really, really hard to outsource. So certain forms of physical labor, hand-eye coordination, these jobs are very hard to outsource. We're much better at software than robots at the moment. So things like plumber, locksmith, construction work, those things will probably remain. The second things that are last to be outsourced, I suspect, will be the industries where we really want humans. So certain forms of primary healthcare, certain forms of education, primary and secondary. If I'm lucky, tertiary education, we'll want humans doing that, at least to train our children. And And then the third category is the jobs that will fight. And there are certain regulated professions, so lawyers, doctors, politicians are pretty good at protecting themselves. And so, yeah, I'm not thinking which ones would we choose to outsource. I suspect what will happen is the economics will push companies to try and outsource where possible, except for the jobs that are either really hard, where we really want humans, or the jobs that fight. And you saw that indeed in the Writers Guild of America strike a couple of years back, where it was kind of amazing that the thing that came out of Hollywood that was a real wake-up call about the impact of AI wasn't yet another Terminator movie. It was the fact that the writers got organized and struck because they didn't want to be replaced by AI. And to me, the lesson of that is not that we shouldn't worry about the Terminator. Yeah, we should worry about lethal autonomous weapons. But that one way to address some of the negative consequences of AI is through organized human labor and organized pushback against some of the negative consequences as we see them.
So unions.
Unions and indeed, the other economic arguments, and I have more kind of academic work, because it'd be kind of boring to talk about antitrust in a novel, is to break up some of these companies. If they're too big to regulate, the lesson we learned from the global financial crisis, if a bank's too big to fail, it's too big. And so if a company is too big to regulate, it's too big. And so it might need to be broken up. And there have been various efforts in the US and the EU. China, which has a different kind of legal system, actually did break up Alibaba into 6 constituent units. That's one possibility. And the other is, if this kind of technology becomes so central to our daily lives that it's an integral part of life, then there's an argument that maybe it is more like electricity or water or certain forms of public transport. And so maybe then it needs to be held in national hands and nationalized. But I realize that's a hard line to push in the United States, or at least I would have said that before the US government decided it was going to take 15% of AMD and NVIDIA's sales to China and a 10% stake in Intel. So maybe that wouldn't have been too much fiction to include, since that's where we are right now.
It's hard to say these days, hard to predict in the US, but what about more governments broadly? We have a question in the chat that wonders, based on unique responsibilities in the public sector, such as balancing innovation, accountability, transparency, and equity, what lessons or warnings from your novel do you think are the most relevant for governments as they consider deploying AI? And I assume this is governments purchasing from developers and deploying for themselves in areas like public safety, social services, and governance. We see some of this in Artifice in terms of the policing and sort of the public health and safety. So how do you think of the lessons Artifice might offer for governments?
Yeah, so Artifice is an example in some ways of the Collingridge dilemma, which is, this is a British guy, David Collingridge wrote The Social Control of Technology, and he wrote about how there's a mismatch between our understanding of risk and ability to prevent it. Because at an early stage of innovation, it's easy to deal with, it's easy to control a new technology, but you don't know what the risks are. The longer you wait, the clearer those risks become, but the cost of regulation, the difficulty goes way up. And we can see that in social media, for example. And so in Artifice, I was trying to project forward, okay, well, what would be some of the things that could develop, and what might we want to kind of roll back? But the problem is, unlike in Artifice, you can't reverse time. You can't sort of go backwards. And so many countries around the world face a real dilemma because they have the choice between under-regulating and over-regulating. If you under-regulate, then you expose people to risk, and that's bad. But if you over-regulate, then some of these technology companies will just say it's not worth going into your jurisdiction. And so particularly for smaller countries, and I would count Singapore among that, there is a tendency, at least in the economic space, to err on the side of under-regulation. As we watch and wait to see what the Americans are going to do, which has really embraced the kind of free market in many places, with a few exceptions like Colorado, but for the most part, minimal regulation. Europe, which has a very rights-based approach, although there's some indication that at least a few Europeans think maybe they've gone too far, and that seems to include the president of France. And then in the middle, or at least in a third part of the triangle, if you like, you've got the Chinese approach, which looks at this very much through a national sovereignty state security lens, but also tries to do some things to minimize the negative impact on society, ranging from sort of limiting time playing video games and watching the TikTok equivalent to sort of the regulation of driverless vehicles. So I think, yeah, around the world, governments are really grappling with this because of the experience of social media, because we had 20 years of sort of dealing with the aftermath of not regulating social media. I think many governments are much more conscious of the need to act, and that's through, among other things, work of organizations like the Future of Privacy Forum. But at the same time, they're very worried about losing out. So for all the fact that we worry in developed countries in particular about misuse of AI, in many parts of the world, they're more worried about missed uses of AI and being left behind or left out.
Fascinating. I feel like just that response alone has given me so much more to think about and apply to Artifice based on my second reread. A good question from Nadia. I had not thought about this perspective. Thank you so much, Nadia. Can AI regulate AI? What would incentivize institutions, private or public, to work together to get to a point where we are the police of robots, or to police, together to get to a point where there are police robots in real life? Can we come to a place where we have agreed on what police robots look like, and can it regulate itself?
Yes, well, I think the documentary RoboCop solved that in the late 1980s, and there was a remake. But no, it's a great question. And there is, I think many people who know Future of Privacy Forum will be familiar with privacy by design. There is a literature on regulation by design, but maybe sticking with the kind of realm of fiction, I think in some ways, those of us who grew up reading Isaac Asimov were both helped and hamstrung by what he did. Helped because he had the idea of essentially building into his robots the famous 3 laws of robotics. But the problem is that that really planted in many people's minds the idea that what you need to regulate AI is just the right list of rules. And if we can do that properly, then we'll solve the problem. Now, these people didn't obviously read Asimov very closely, because in the very first story where he introduced the rules, Run Around, back in 1942, they didn't work. And if they had worked, his stories would have been boring. He was a much better science fiction writer than he was legislator. But there is this idea that if only the rules could be kind of built in, then the problems would be solved. But that, in turn, is linked with one of the reasons why I think lawyers have a strong future ahead of them. Because for 40 years, people have been saying law will be completely replaced by AI or robots or something, because that is premised on the idea that law is just the application of rules to facts. And if you can do that like a mathematical equation, it's simple. But anyone who's studied law knows that the rules are never that clear, the facts are always in dispute, and therein lies the debate. So I do think there is an element of regulation by design, building in safety protocols and so on. And indeed, that's part of the through line of the book, is that in addition to the sort of containment protocols that fail, the kill switch that kind of works, but in a weird way, underlying that is a kind of moral sensibility that embraces at least a notion of human values that becomes important. Now, how do you code that, however? How do you code morality? There was a brief flurry of businesses trying to sell ethics as a service, as if the reason we hadn't solved ethical problems is we didn't have enough data. And if you could only sort of get all the human data together, then we could solve ethics. As opposed to realizing that ethics, a bit like law, embraces a whole bunch of inherently insolvable problems. So I suppose to answer the question much more briefly, I think the key question with AI is not how do we get it to police itself, but how do we structure the incentives so that the people developing, deploying, and using it are held to account. Because at least for the moment, unlike in the book, I think it would be meaningless to say that the AI itself is responsible. The AI is a tool. It's a tool for good, a tool for ill. But for the purposes of accountability, I think we still want to go back to traditional persons.
I agree. And in that sort of reference point, I think one of the things that when I think about traditional persons and characteristics I associate with them, one of them is creativity. And I kind of associate artistic, creative, and representative of the human experience sort of work, something I would like to preserve and not necessarily just say AI make us art that represents our experiences. And in that vein, Haley asks, what kinds of policies could ensure that AI is developed and used in ways that enhance rather than undermine human creativity?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I was recently at Singapore Polytechnic talking with some students who were doing AI manga, and they were really excited about the tools that they could use to bring their creativity to life, and really depressed that no one was ever going to pay them for this work because it's so easy. It's trivially easy now to create something. And so it's a bit like the flip side of Andy Warhol's in the future. Everyone will be famous for 15 minutes. Today, you could be famous, but for 15 nanoseconds or to 15 bots. Because as the cost of creativity goes down, the ability to sustain an arts sector also goes down. And so, I mean, one of the things, I suppose, one serious thing and then one thing in the book. The serious thing is intellectual property. And there are lawsuits going on about how these systems are vacuuming up all of human culture and then spitting it back out at us. And without wanting to cast shade on anyone who Ghiblified themselves, that moment when there was a flurry of activity and people put up Studio Ghibli versions of themselves on the internet was kind of funny and cool, but only possible because Miyazaki and the team of illustrators had spent decades generating this art, and now it was all being used for free. And doubly ironic because he himself had sort of said that he thought AI was a kind of curse on humanity. So I suppose the two answers to the question is one, if AI is going to use our creativity and use the work of our creators, the companies can pay for it somehow. And that's complex, but possible. And then secondly, the output should not be copyrightable, meaning the output should not be able to generate income if it's purely AI generated. And that's the position in most countries around the world. But that first part of whether you have to pay, whether this amounts to fair use, is being litigated in many countries at the moment, including in the United States. But yeah, I think if you want to have a thriving arts sector, the reason we have intellectual property laws is to incentivize and reward human innovation. And if we want to continue having human innovation and creativity and the arts, then these people need to be able to make a living out of it.
Absolutely agree. As the daughter of two writers, I must absolutely agree, who I think are both watching right now. Hi, Mom and Dad. So to tie us up, we are at time. One last question for you. With the last question in mind, what stories do we need now? You've described yourself as an aspiring writer, and I'm sure there are many more aspiring writers out there who would love to have themes of technology, of AI in their stories. What stories do we need now to help us guide to a good future?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is we need more satire. We need more criticism. And one of the problems is that some of the leaders in the tech space claim to love stories about technology, but they don't appear to have read them very closely. So Elon Musk routinely says that The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is one of his favorite books, not realizing that he is the villain in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We've had examples like Peter Thiel claims to love Lord of the Rings. And in Lord of the Rings, there's Palantir, these stones that are a metaphor for the evils of surveillance and manipulation. And Peter Thiel says, great, I'm going to name my company Palantir. We've got Jeff Bezos claims to love Star Trek, which is famously a kind of post-capitalist abundant society, which is not exactly what Amazon is building. So I think we need more stories like that. But I suppose the last thing I'd say in terms of stories is just that we need more human stories. We need more people to write. And there's a joke, not a very funny joke, in the novel where one of the characters, Mel, is writing a novel. And Archie says, well, I didn't realize people still wrote novels. And so again, I did this before ChatGPT, but now after ChatGPT, I really do worry about the extent to which we're offloading not just the ability to remember telephone numbers, which are now, we store them in our phones rather than our heads, not just the ability to navigate, where we use Google Maps or Apple Maps rather than reading a map, but if we're giving up our ability to form opinions, our ability to express emotions, because we're not able to verbalize them or do what humans have done since before we could even write, where we had stories. If we're not doing that, then we're not just losing the ability to sort of do convenient things, we're losing a huge part of what it is to be human. So yeah, the short answer is keep writing.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for your time, Simon, today. And thank you for sharing this story with us and with the world. I highly recommend Artifice for anyone who has not had a chance to read. We have dropped a link to the book in the comments. Please check it out. Thank you again, Simon, for your time so late in the evening in Singapore. We appreciate it. And we hope that everyone will join us for more FPF book clubs in the future.
Thank you, Jordan. Good night, everyone.